In this tutorial, we're going to look at how we can intersect masks. And intersecting just means adding one mask or subtracting one mask from another mask. It's a process that's complicated in Photoshop, but made much easier through Instamask. Now, there are no images to work with in this video. I just want you to watch along so you can see exactly what intersecting is. Now, if I open up Instamask, I want to show you quickly what I mean by adding and subtracting masks. I'm just going to open Darks 1 mask. And you can see we've got a good selection of the shadows, the foreground, but also some of the sky. Now, if I press this button here, Combi, we'll save our mask on a layer called Original. There's our mask. Now, let's say I want to take this mask, but I want to remove the sky from it. So I just want a selection from the foreground. Well, that's quite easy with this image because if I make all these layers invisible, except for the original layer, you see my base exposure here. I have a darker exposure on top and my base exposure at the bottom has a really good selection of the sky. So if I choose a Brights 1 mask this time, let's bring the sliders up and I just want to select the sky. So there you go. Now I've made a selection of the sky. So I want to subtract this selection of the sky from this mask. And if I do that, it should make the sky black. So whatever I've selected in this mask is going to be removed from this mask. So to subtract a selection, we can click on Subbed, S-U-B-T, subtract. And now our new mask has a completely black sky and a totally white foreground. Now we can do the opposite of that and add things to our mask. So let's say I want to add the sky to the mask. I can press Combi again. And let's do that same process. I'm going to create a Brights mask. Make it really contrasting, so we're just selecting the sky. And then if I press the Add button, now we have the sky selected in the mask, and we have the foreground selected in the mask. So how is this useful? Well, in the past, people used to intersect dark masks to blend in shadows. But since I came up with matching, we don't have to do that anymore. We can just match our exposures, and that saves us all the hassle. But let's have a look at an example in a real workflow of how we can use this. Now, I used these example images a while ago on YouTube for the same thing using the old Instamask. So I want to show you how we do it with the new Instamask. And it's more or less the same process. So I've blended these two exposures. And let's say hypothetically, I wanted to select the brightest parts of the lavender field here because I want to brighten them up. I don't want to select the darker parts or the parts in the foreground. Now with Instamask, I can create a Brights mask and that's not going to give us a good selection. I can create a Midtones mask and that's not giving us a good selection. So I just want the field to be white. I can try a Darks mask, but no, that selects all of the field and it doesn't just select the brightest parts of the field, obviously. So how can I do this? Well, I can choose the RGB masks and we can add or subtract any mask we want. So the potential here is limitless. But I want to find a mask that's going to give us a good selection of the brightest parts of these fields, but it might also give us a selection of other things like the sky as well, and that's fine. So what if I use a Brights 1 on the red channel? Well, that's actually done a pretty good job. The lavender field here is quite bright compared to the darker parts of the field. What about the green channel? No, that's quite dull. And the blue channel, that's even worse. So let's try a Brights 1. I'm going to close that and I'm going to tweak the sliders. I want to make it much more contrasting so that we select mainly just the brighter parts of the fields in the field area. Naturally, we're going to be selecting the sky too. I'm going to bring down that mid-tone slider a bit more and keep bringing along this highlight slider because that seems to be doing a better job of selecting the field. Now we've selected much of that part of the field to the left. Let's try and select a little bit more down the right. I'm going to bring the highlight slider along more, and that's done a pretty good job. Now again, you can see we've selected the sky here, but that's okay because we can remove the sky with a mask that we can create on a base exposure. But first, let's press Combi and save our mask there. So now we can see the mask that we created. Now I want to make a selection of the sky so we can remove it from that mask. So we know we can make a selection from the sky through the base exposure. So if I press a Brights 1, there's the base exposure and there's a good selection of the sky. So bring along that highlight slider just to remove any of the field. And then if I'm happy, I can press subtract. Now we've got a fantastic selection of the field here in the foreground, the brightest parts, without selecting the darkest parts of the field. So why is that useful? Well, if we press D and B, dodge and burn, now I've created a dodge and burn layer. I can make the dark exposure visible. I can open the dodge and burn panel and I can choose a brush, let's say a white brush to start off with. I can begin to paint in the fields. So let's paint over here to start off with. Now, it doesn't look very good. It looks a little bit too strong. So if we press overlay, that'll strengthen the effect, but then we can reduce that strength significantly so it looks better. So there we go. You see, we're giving our field more life. And I'm going to bring down the opacity of this brush to around 50%. And I'm going to do the field over here, just brightening up those areas. Now, if you find that that's a little bit too strong, I can undo some of those areas over there and change my opacity to 30% and just brighten up the areas over there. Now, I could also choose one of these colors. Let's say I choose this color here and paint on the field. You see, we're adding some gorgeous warmth to the field instead. If I change my brush opacity, let's say to 100%, just to show you a stronger effect, you see we're really adding warmth to that field. It doesn't look very natural. We can use a different color, a more beige color, and that gives us a more subtle job. Or we can press this eyedropper tool and choose something in the image, like a beige in the sky, or even a green, or any color you want to paint in that area. Now, as it stands, this might not look particularly natural, especially over here. So if I choose my foreground color tool and choose a gray color, I can again choose my brush and just paint over those areas. And look, we're reducing the effect of the dodge and burn. Now, if I undo that and choose 50% opacity, you can undo that effect just a bit more subtly. So we still have some brightened areas along there. We don't want this tree up here to be affected. So here is a good before and after. It makes a huge difference. I'm just going to paint across the tops of these fields here to make it look a little bit more natural. Now, just because we have this mask on here doesn't mean we have to recreate the mask using Instamask and, intersecting masks. To get this selection again, we can hold down Control on a PC or Command on a Mac and left click on the mask, and you see we get the mask back. So I could even open up a curves layer, let's say, which has that mask applied, and we can brighten up those selected areas. Or I can change my curve from RGB to red, and I could add a little bit of warmth to those areas. So the options here are more or less limitless. And again, if anything looks unnatural, we can choose a black brush with the mask selected this time and just paint it out. Because naturally we need these effects to look relatively natural. So what about intersecting masks with exposure blending? Well, most of the time you won't need to do that. However, that doesn't mean you'll never need to be able to do it. So let me show you an example of intersecting masks with exposure blending. Here we have two exposures, dark exposure and a base exposure. Now I'm going to select these two and I'm going to duplicate them and put them in a group. Now, with the dark exposure invisible, I want a selection of the sky. So if I press Brights 1, that doesn't give us a great selection of the sky, but I know that if we go into the RGB channel and I press Brights 1 on the blue channel, see how bright the sky becomes? And now I can bring my slider along, and now we've got a good selection of the sky, excluding the foreground objects. And if I apply that to the dark layer, we of course have a decent blend. However, let's say for example you don't like this bridge, you think it looks too bright. And in the mask, the bridge is reasonably well selected, but actually it's grey in some areas. So you want it to be more selected in this mask, which means it will be darker than it currently is. So how do we do that? Well, we create exactly the same mask that we just created. So I'm going to make the darker exposure invisible, open up the blue channel again, close that, bring the slider along, make a good selection. And what we want is to make this bridge 100% white in the mask. Now, clearly that hasn't happened in this mask. So what we can do is we can press Combi, and that again saves our mask. Then we can press, let's say, this manual button. And here we're going to be able to manually select any color we want. Now I only want to affect the bridge, so I'm going to change my fuzziness to around 66, and I'm going to choose localized color clusters. And that means we only affect the areas around the bridge. Now if you want to add more shades to the bridge, you can choose this plus tool and select on more of the bridge. And it's okay that some of the house is selected there as well, but if you don't want it to be, we can bring the range down even more, so that we're mainly just selecting the bridge. You can select that part of the bridge too. And now if you're happy, that means we've now got a selection of the bridge and the mask. Now remember, we want to add the bridge to the mask here. We want to make the bridge wider. So we simply go to Instamask and we press Add. Now look how white the bridge is compared to the previous mask. So if we go on our dark layer and press Apply, we've now darkened that bridge significantly, so it's not standing out super white anymore. Now I don't know if you prefer it to be brighter or not, but this is just an example to show you how it works. So to show you the difference there, I'm going to zoom in. So this is the blend when we've intersected masks. See, the bridge is a little bit darker. And this is the blend when we hadn't intersected masks. See, the bridge is brighter. Now, as it happens, I prefer a brighter bridge, but either way, this shows you how useful intersecting can be when exposure blending. Now, I mentioned earlier on that the most common way to blend a brighter exposure into a darker exposure, so to recover highlights, was through intersecting masks. Again, we don't need to do that anymore since we now have matching. But I want to show you that process anyway. So here are two exposures, a brighter exposure on top, and we have a base exposure with most of our information. Now I just want to recover the information here in this big rock. So I'm going to make this brighter exposure visible because that's going to give us the best selection of the rock. If I try to create a selection of the rock using this exposure, we're also going to get lots of the sky in there. So let's keep the brighter exposure visible. Open Instamask, and we're choosing the darks masks, remember, because we're trying to get to the shadows. And let's say I choose a darks 4 and I press select. I choose a black mask, press hide the marching ants, choose a white brush at 100% opacity, and watch what happens when I start to blend in that rock. It really flattens the contrast. It doesn't look very good at all. And that was usually what we got when we blended exposures in the past without matching. So this is why we used to intersect masks. So what people used to do instead was choose a more general darks mask. So let's say a darks 2. So that selects most of the rock. We press combi, and then we choose a darks 4, which is just selecting the darkest parts of the rock, and we'd simply press subtract. Now by doing that, we have a more general selection of the rocks, but we haven't got much selection of the shadows in the rocks. And that actually allows us to maintain some of that contrast when we're luminosity masking. So I'm going to show you this again, the white brush. And you see now we're bringing back that rock, but we're not losing too much contrast. It's not as flat as it was. And this is what the mask looks like. But again, that's an unnecessarily complicated process because now we can just match exposures. So I'm going to delete that mask, go to Instamask, choose, let's say, a darks 1. And we want to select the rock, but not the sky. How about going to the RGB channel, try darks 1 in the green? Nope. In red, in blue. Blue gives us a good selection there. And I can even bring the midtone slider along a little bit more. Press select, choose a black mask and a white brush, hide the marching ants, and then I can paint in the rock. And I can do that a couple of times. And if we want to give it contrast or make it look more natural, we can double click and open up Adobe Camera Raw. We can darken the exposure slightly, add some clarity, which will give it some contrast, maybe even bring up the shadows a little bit, and then press OK. And you see we give our image the contrast that it needs. So there's before and there's after. So we don't really need to intersect masks to blend in dark exposures anymore. It's just not necessary. We can use matching instead. However, you will find intersecting masks really useful in other parts of your workflow. And every now and then, when blending exposures like this one, you might find it useful to make extra selections that haven't been included in your initial mask. But this is one of those tools that really is limitless. I mean, you can intersect any masks you want. You can come up with any selection you want. So how you use it is entirely up to you, and you might be really creative with this. You might come up with some fantastic ideas which I never thought of. And I really hope that that is the case.